Hello besties and welcome to another Genshin theory! If you've been watching my other videos on Sumeru, you know that I really didn't enjoy the rainforest. But the desert came out not too long ago and I'm already in love with it. Maybe that's just because my favorite game ever is Fallout New Vegas, so I feel at home in a desert full of robots. And just like Fallout New Vegas, Genshin's desert is experiencing a power struggle between different factions. Followers of the Dendro Archon and those of the Scarlet King Deshret. Today we're going to look at King Deshret's lore and what it means for Teyvat as a whole. Keep in mind that all of the Archon quests for Sumeru aren't out yet, so this may end up being way off. When we're first introduced to King Deshret in Port Ormos, it seems like he's a terrible person. Ain al-Ahmar, the sect of the Eremites dedicated to wreaking havoc on Sumeru, was founded in his name. Ain al-Ahmar has been a secondary antagonist to the Academia sages throughout all 4 of the Sumeru Archon quests we've seen so far, so before part 4 of the Archon quest, it was safe to assume that Deshret was just as bad as his followers. But he was actually not controversial during his life at all. He was friends with the Goddess of Flowers and Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, and the 3 of them ruled Sumeru together. Rukkhadevata and the Flower Goddess were both very benevolent deities, so I assume they wouldn't associate with Deshret if he was a bad guy. Deshret actually had a huge crush on the Goddess of Flowers that she knew about, but it's unclear whether or not she felt the same way. Regardless, Deshret was not the malevolent man that the Academia purposefully and Ain al-Ahmar inadvertently makes him out to be. In the Archon quest, we go inside the mausoleum of King Deshret. There we get one of my favorite cutscenes we've seen in a long time.
Civilization is born of knowledge, but so too can knowledge be its demise. A disaster caught us unaware. It was knowledge that did not belong to this world. The Scarlet King brought this forbidden knowledge into our world, and it quickly spread like a plague. People's minds were filled with crazed whispers. Dark gray scales spread across their bodies. Even the land was stripped of its vigor. Only a desperate, deathly silence remained. Were it not for Greater Lord Rukkhadevata from the forests, the damage would have been irreversible. She summoned the priests to build temples and infused into them the divine power of life. The disaster was miraculously tempered, and the embers of our civilization were preserved in Aru village. Alas, the miracle could not last. As long as forbidden knowledge continued to exist, it would forever blight this world. In the end, the proud king of the desert, my eternal lord, chose to sacrifice himself. I have spent my whole life since guarding one of these many temples. But now, my duty is coming to an end. As I close my eyes for the final time, the sight of that noble deity will appear in my vision once more. In helping the Scarlet King to eradicate forbidden knowledge, she exhausted her strength, and her form became that of a small child. How strange. Now that I think of her, I no longer have any fear of death, for I sense that the spirit of life will abide with me during my eternal sleep. Children of the desert, cling no longer to past grievances, but hold tight to the memory of this act of benevolence.
This explains so many of the questions we've had about Sumeru since we got here. We learned that the Withering and Elazar were the result of Deshret's corruption and inevitable death, and that Rukkhadevata died not in the Cataclysm, but when she came to the desert to try to save Deshret's life. But in the chaos, she died and was reborn as the child Archon we know as Lesser Lord Kusanali or Nahida. There's a lot to unpack with the specific event of Deshret's death, but what stands out to me most is how he died. The actual cause is unclear, but I think we all know what it had to be: erosion. Like I mentioned before, King Deshret was a very sentimental person who felt as if he had lost himself after the schism in Sumeru. The country used to be wholly united until the Goddess of Flowers died, and her death caused Deshret and Rukkhadevata to drift apart and lead their own communities within Sumeru. Deshret was good friends with Rukkhadevata and deeply in love with the Goddess of Flowers, so this event was especially upsetting for him. In the desert, Deshret was called the Mourning God by his people because he was constantly in a state of depression all the way up until his death. I think Deshret was accidentally responsible for his own death death because he was never able to move on from the past. Erosion of the Gods has been a huge topic of discussion in 2 of the 4 countries we've been to so far. In Liyue, we saw the effects of erosion in Azhdaha, who has completely forgotten the person he used to be and his old friendships. In Inazuma, we learned that the Raiden Shogun was created as a puppet ruler to prevent the country from having a leader weak enough to succumb to erosion. In both Liyue and Inazuma, the Archons deliberately stepped away from their positions of power to prevent their inevitable erosions from destroying the countries they worked so hard to maintain. You could argue that the same thing is happening in Mondstadt, even if Venti never had much control of Mondstadt to give up anyway. The point is that erosion has been really important everywhere so far, but we haven't heard much about it in Sumeru. And that makes sense. The current Archon of Sumeru is far too young and inexperienced to go through erosion anytime soon. Nahida's only 500 years old and she never leaves the sanctuary of Surasthana. But Deshret wasn't a kid. We don't know exactly how old he was, but we know he wasn't as young as Nahida is now. After the Goddess of Flowers died and Deshret and Rukkhadevata went their separate ways, Deshret was never able to move on from the traumatic split of his friend group, and it caused erosion to overcome him while he was distracted. And because Deshret still had so much influence over the desert, it didn't just affect him, but his people as well. Elazar and the Withering exist throughout Sumeru now, but they originated only in the desert. But the real reason that all of this happened was because Deshret started to spread forbidden knowledge. We've covered this 1,000 times by now. Celestia doesn't like it when people know too much. We've seen multiple deaths because of this. We know about Urabashi for sure, and it's widely believed that Guizhong was killed for knowing too much. Lisa traded a large portion of her lifespan for forbidden information, and now she could die at any moment. With Urabashi, we know exactly what happened to him, not so much with Lisa and Guizhong. Urabashi read Before Sun and Moon, a book detailing the history of Teyvat before Celestia was founded, figured out that Celestia was planning to kill him because he learned something he wasn't supposed to, then sacrificed his life during Watatsumi's invasion of Yashiori Island so he wouldn't have to die at Celestia's hands. If Urabashi hadn't done this, Watatsumi Island might not even be here anymore. We didn't have any idea what would have happened otherwise, but now I think we do because of Deshret's story. But what was this forbidden knowledge and how did he receive it? Deshret's life was peaceful until the Goddess of Flowers died. There was no indication that he was a danger to himself and others before that. I think that when Deshret was left to rule the desert alone, he didn't know how, so he turned to another civilization for help. The desert is full of Khaenri'ah activity. There are actually robots that look suspiciously similar to ruined cruisers that are exclusive to the desert. These robots, called primal constructs, have archived descriptions that make me think that they're not only from Khaenri'ah, but were sent to the desert specifically to help King Deshret. In the Repulsor's description, it says that these machines were not first built to be temple guards or palace defenders, but instead to rebirth the paradise that the foolish desert ruler dreamed of. That's confirmation that the primal constructs were designed exclusively for Deshret's use, but I really doubt he or any other desert dwellers made them. They look just like other Khaenri'ah automatons besides the color scheme. Deshret was in a really dark place after the Goddess of Flowers died. He was sad literally all the time, so he clearly wasn't in the right headspace to be ruling the desert by himself. Khaenri'ah envoys might have noticed this and seen an opportunity to spread their influence to the surface. It might sound stupid to say that Khaenri'ah sought out a partnership with a deity because they famously hated the gods, but Deshret was a minor deity with barely any power of his own. He wasn't an Archon and he didn't have full control of a country. And at the time when Khaenri'ah likely would have reached out to Deshret, he was vulnerable and alone, likely willing to agree to anything that seemed slightly beneficial. Khaenri'ahs didn't necessarily have to like Deshret to team up with him. They were probably just using him for their own gain. This wouldn't be the first time they've hurt someone to get what they want. Khaenri'ah envoys invaded Enkanomiya, stole a book from the library, and left Ante the librarian to die after he was hit by a ruin guard. I won't get into every little detail on what I think Khaenri'ah was up to before the Cataclysm, so just watch any of my recent videos on Khaenri'ah for that. Long story short, it seems like Khaenri'ah was planning to take over the above-ground world of Teyvat in retaliation for being trapped underground in a mirrored dimension. Khaenri'ahs saw that Deshret had influence over a community on the surface, and they wanted to spread their ideals throughout Teyvat in preparation for this invasion. By placing their robots in the desert, they got a head start. Deshret was desperate to make the desert a good place. In the description of the Reshaper, one of the automatons found only in the desert, it says the Lord of the Blazing Sun promised his people a utopia on the other side of existence. Today, that utopia is long gone. Deshret was actively working on improving the desert and making it a perfect place to live, likely with the help of the Khaenri'ahs he made a deal with. In return for Deshret's cooperation, Khaenri'ahs must have told him the forbidden knowledge that inevitably led to his demise. This forbidden knowledge was likely given to him under the pretense of it being useful for creating the utopia he dreamed of. Instead, it was the opposite. It caused him and his society to crumble. Khaenri'ahs likely knew that Deshret was vulnerable, but they may not have known that he was slowly succumbing to erosion at this point. I doubt Deshret himself even knew it. It was too late to prevent when he forgot that he had to keep this forbidden information a secret. He mistakenly shared it with the humans he presided over and was killed because of it. This might sound like a crazy coincidence, but I think that happened around the same time as the Cataclysm. In the cutscene where we learned about Deshret's death, we see that Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, quote, made herself small as her old friend was dying, which resulted in the birth of Lesser Lord Kusanali. Kusanali, or as we know her, Nahida, is 500 years old. Her birth happened the same number of years ago as the Cataclysm. Leakers have said that in 3.2, it's revealed that only 6 of the 7 Archons were actually in Khaenri'ah during the Cataclysm, meaning that one was in their home country. We already know for sure that both of the Raiden twins were in Khaenri'ah at some point, and that Zhongli wasn't at the chasm to prevent the Rifthound attack that caused the death of Bosacius during the Cataclysm, so it can't be either of them. It's implied that Venti was also in Khaenri'ah for the Cataclysm because in his collected miscellany video, Dainsleif says that the last time he saw Venti was 500 years ago.
1,000 years have passed since the god of Anemo left this land. But to me, it has only been half that time.
We know that the Tsaritsa definitely had to be there because she was so traumatized by the violence she witnessed that her entire personality changed. Murata the Pyro Archon is the god of war, so she was probably there for Teyvat's biggest war in recent history. That only leaves the Hydro and Dendro Archons, but I think it's clear that Rukkhadevata was the one who was missing. Nahida's age gives it away. If my theory about the Archons being forced to destroy Khaenri'ah by Celestia is true, and it seems more like it is with every update, then how come Rukkhadevata got out of it? I don't think she did. I think she had to have been in Khaenri'ah at some point during the Cataclysm, but left when she somehow realized that Deshret was dying. She quickly went back to Sumeru in an attempt to save his life, but it was already too late. The forbidden knowledge provided to him by Khaenri'ah had already corrupted the desert, and Erosion had already overcome him. There was no way to prevent his death, but being the benevolent deity and good friend she was, Rukkhadevata tried anyway. She died with Deshret, but not before splitting herself into the newly born god of wisdom, Kusanali. The plant life we see in the mausoleum of Deshret is not only a literal effect of what happened in that area, but it's symbolic too. Deshret and Rukkhadevata now share a final resting place, the desert pyramid his and the vines hers. Even before Sumeru was released, one of my favorite theories I ever wrote was about how history repeats itself all the time in Teyvat due to ley lines and constellations. Sumeru's Archon quests, especially the ones in the rainforest, reminded me of this theme of repeated history, but we didn't have any international examples until the release of the desert. Deshret's story is not unique. We've actually heard of something nearly identical happening in Liyue around the beginning of the Archon War. Whaley Assembly was a smaller version of Liyue's current society led by 3 gods, Guizhong, Morax, and Marcosius. It's implied that Guizhong and Morax were in love, but then she died and the group of 3 was fractured. After a long time where the 2 surviving gods were separated, one became a smaller and less powerful version of themselves. This is the exact same thing that happened with Deshret, Rukkhadevata, and the Goddess of Flowers. The difference is that Morax and Marcosius, unlike Deshret and Rukkhadevata, aren't dead. I think that's due to a combination of smarter choices and just luck of the time period. That being said, these stories are strikingly similar, and there must be an explanation as to why. In my theories about repeated history, I said that people with the same constellation share similar fates, and that events that take place on certain ley lines can happen again if the ley line is disordered. We don't have time to get into all that, so I'll link the videos explaining that in the description and the pinned comment. I think the similarities between these events can be explained with either option. We don't know how long ley lines actually are. A line from Sumeru's desert to Liyue would have to be really long, but since the 2 countries border each other, I don't think that's necessarily impossible. It could also be due to people having the same constellations. I've already theorized that Lisa and Guizhong share the constellation Tempus Fugit because of their similar stories, but we don't know enough about the Goddess of Flowers to decide whether or not she was also a Tempus Fugit. With Marcosius and Rukkhadevata, we don't know either of their constellations, so it could be possible that they have the same one, but again, we don't really know enough to decide. That leaves Deshret and Morax to share the constellation of Lapis Dei. Lapis Dei is Latin for God of Stone, which makes perfect sense for Morax, who is literally the Geo Archon. It makes a little less sense for Deshret at first, but this guy was the ruler of the desert, and if you don't know, sand is just a bunch of tiny little rocks. This video has kind of been all over the place, so I'll summarize. King Deshret was a minor god who was friends with Greater Lord Rukkhadevata and the Goddess of Flowers. Deshret was in love with the Goddess of Flowers, so her death greatly affected him. He and Rukkhadevata drifted apart and formed their own communities on opposite sides of Sumeru, his in the desert and hers in the rainforest. Left to rule the desert by himself for the first time in his life following the loss of his 2 closest friends, Deshret didn't know what to do. Khaenri'ah envoys saw his vulnerability and made a deal with him. He would let them place their robots in the desert and they would share forbidden knowledge with him. Unbeknownst to both parties, Deshret was succumbing to erosion, and he eventually forgot that he was supposed to keep this information a secret. He spread it throughout the desert, causing him and his people to die. While in Khaenri'ah during the Cataclysm, Rukkhadevata noticed that Deshret was dying, and she went back home to try to save him. Rukkhadevata made herself into a small child version of herself before dying with him. Deshret's death caused Elazar and the Withering to form and spread throughout the country. The ley lines he was on, or his constellation, which may be Lapis Dei, might be to blame for his untimely demise. I actually feel pretty good about this theory. I obviously don't know how true it is, but I like this version of Deshret that I've come up with. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, it's just for fun. I actually have favorite lore characters, and he's definitely one of them now. I just find Deshret's story really interesting, and I think it would have been cool if he was still alive and we got to meet him in-game. I think the desert has been 1,000 times better than the rainforest. I actually liked the Archon quests in the desert, and I really didn't like the ones in the rainforest. 3.1's been a great update overall with banners and events too. I love Vine Lisa Fest, and I can't wait to pull for Nilou in a few days. I'm so sad that I have to skip Cyno, but I'm sure he'll rerun eventually. Thank you so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Bye, besties!